Okay. So hopefully the audio is working well. I don't really know. Don't be nervous or anything. I'll be able to edit anything that's said.
I hope.
Okay.
I hope that I have something good to say.
I think you'll have a lot of good things to say. Do you want to start with how your day was?
How my day was?
Yeah.
It was not a real great day. I'm lacking energy. I'm tired, and I don't have, and I think mostly has to do with all the pills that I take.
Yeah.
Blood pressure medication and
Talk
stuff.
louder.
No, that's okay. He has a microphone.
I think that's what pretty much knocks my socks off.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit? I know you kind of know what we're talking about today. Do you want to talk a little bit about just like that time of your life when Vietnam started? Kind of like maybe how you found out it started?
Well, I was going to school in Chicago, and Grandma was going to school in Milwaukee, so we didn't see a whole lot of each other. About once a month we'd get together back in Belvedere. The Vietnam War was going on at the time, and I had a best friend who was over there, and I'm not sure just exactly what Tet is. That's it's a holiday of some sort for the Vietnamese. I don't know if that's the New Year, the Vietnamese New Year, or what. But at the beginning of Tet, the Vietnamese, of course, with the help of the Chinese, got decided it was time to get the Americans out of Vietnam, and so it was 1968 was the worst year for sheer numbers of American soldiers to lose their life. And that particular day, March 7th, was like the second worst sheer numbers of lost lives in the war. But I mean, most people didn't. It wasn't like today where there's so many people out in the streets. There were some certainly, but not to the extent like today. And I was going to school in Chicago. It wasn't, Columbia University. It was a chiropractic school. We didn't have protests on campus. So, it wasn't. Everybody didn't walk around talking about, the war and getting rid of the war or killing more communists or whatever, that kind of stuff just wasn't pervasive.
I think at the larger universities there were lots of protests.
Oh, there were more protests going on, but it started then. I mean, that's really when most of that stuff got started, because it was less than a month later that Martin Luther King was murdered. And, of course, not too many months later than that, Bobby Kennedy was too. But it wasn't a pleasant time, that's for sure.
Do you remember like seeing anything on TV or over the radio that like I don't know, made you stop or like think a little bit or like made you sad?
Well, I just remember it wasn't too long after that Lyndon Johnson made his speech where he said, "I will not seek nor will I accept and run for another term in president." And I said, "Yay." I mean, he was a Democrat, but I didn't care. He wasn't my idea of a good president, because he made a mess out of something that was already bad to begin with. Of course, at 19 years old, I wasn't really smart enough to realize just what a mess that really was at the time. You formulate opinions about stuff like that as you get older. and that, but you know, that's kind of the basis for the whole thing. I mean, even like Mitt Romney's dad, who was pro-war, took a trip over there, and when he came back, he said, "This is a mess. We need to get the hell out of there."
Yeah.
I mean, in so many words, but
What was his name?
huh?
What was his first name?
What was his dad's first name? I can't remember, but he had been, I think, the governor of Michigan, or became the governor of Michigan later. I can't remember, but I think he was a senator from Michigan at the time. But he changed his mind on the subject. So obviously there were people who were thinking.
Yeah. So obviously there's like every war, there's a lot of people that don't want to be in the war.
Yeah.
But I feel like Vietnam was one of the first wars where there was like mass protests to it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was because it was televised and like because there's so much more information than maybe you would have gotten 30 years before?
I don't think it was. I don't really think it was as. I mean, certainly it's not as information wise as all the what we're getting today, because what they were pumping out then was more information. Today, there's about 10% information and 90% opinion, and that's really about all. So people start believing other people's opinion rather than what maybe the truth really is, or what it possibly is. But yeah, there was certainly enough information every night. There was, numbers. They'd put numbers up there, and who knows how factual they were. 12 Marines were killed today, and 100,000 Vietnamese. Well, I don't know how that could happen on a daily, but I mean that's an exaggerated figure, but it just seemed like the numbers were outrageous.
Yeah. Do you remember having any like strong opinions like before Jeff died?
No, it was like the Vietnam was supposedly about another extension of stopping communism in the world, and it was pretty horrendous how it all got started, because they were, there was practically every night on the news back in the 50s there was, the House Un-American Activities Committee was led by the Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin, who was just about as brain damaged as the current president. Maybe even more, because he actually served. I know he was actually a serviceman, I think, in World War II. They called him Tail Gunner Joe.
Interesting.
But he wasn't exactly, But we had this paranoia about communism, and to some extent, or still, I guess, a great extent, we do have this paranoia about communism, that it's just another philosophy of government. It may not be a great one, but there's flaws in every.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could I say something?
Yeah, you can ask
Yeah.
something.
His friend's name was Jeff Smith,
Mm-hmm.
and his mother did not want him to go into the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
She practically begged him not to. But his grandfather was, his father was, and it's just sort of expected Jeff
Mm-hmm.
will
Yeah. Okay. Now I'll be able to see if it runs out, so I can stop.
Okay.
But yeah, so how was the day of when you guys found out?
What's that?
This is the day that we found out
Yeah.
about Jeff being killed, and so I was in Belvedere at Terry's house. He was obviously back there, and there was a phone call, and it was his old girlfriend, and I thought, the hell she called? Anyhow, she was the bearer of bad news and told Terry that Jeff had been killed, and just the look on his face, you know. He wanted to go over there immediately to Mrs. Smith's house, to the mom's house. So we did, and there was all kinds of people there, and Mrs. Smith was laying on the couch, and Terry's old girlfriend was just holding her hand, sitting on the couch next to her, and she was just wailing. It was, God, it's all those years ago, and it's so emotional still. She said, I didn't want him to go, and it was, what do you say, what do you do, you know, and that was just such an emotional day, and I think it took Terry years to get over that. Maybe he never really did get over it, but eventually you move on, but I think it took a lot more time than we both realized it was going to take, and it kind of affected our whole relationship a little bit, I believe, so
Yeah.
that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Grandpa, what do you think about the day of when you found out?
Yeah, it was pretty much, in your mind it was pretty much chaotic because like Grandma said, there wasn't anything you could do. Shortly after we got there, his mom just laid down on the couch and buried her face in the back of the
Couch.
because there was, actually the people that were there to console her couldn't do with anything. There was nothing anybody could do to console her.
And the funeral wasn't it in the Catholic Church? The funeral?
Yeah.
And it was packed. There was so
Yeah.
many people. Jeff was well liked, and just the fact that he was a 19-year-old kid who lost his life in a senseless war. There were so many people there. So, yeah.
Yeah, it took 2 weeks to get him home. That's how it wasn't exactly like. I don't know how long it takes to get somebody home from where they're at now, but.
And I think the number of deaths was like
My light turned off. I'm sorry.
around 58,000. Yeah, it was close to 60,000. Yeah.
Oh no. That's okay. We don't need the light.
It's gonna be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know it certainly affected Mrs. Smith for the rest of her life. She had 2 young kids still at home, very young, and she worked. She worked nights. She was a hard worker. And I really came to know her and love her. I really did.
Mm-hmm.
She drank too much, but what you saw was what you got. She was very honest, and when she liked you, she'd do anything for you.
Mm-hmm.
We went out on occasion and, had good talks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it certainly affected her for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what you guys said about how Jeff passing away kind of affected your guys' relationship?
Well, I think you have to look back at it, because at the time you're going through it, you don't realize what it's really like. And I think for a number of years, I mean, I had nightmares. I mean, I call them, they were dreams when he was still alive. But I know to some extent, we both drank more than because of that. I mean, I know I did, and when two people are having a bad day, there's more apt to be a fight than if just one or the other is having a bad day. But then it's not good, to say the least.
Yeah.
I don't know if Terry kept, this is just my opinion, he kept, like, quitting different, he was in chiropractic school. He went a couple years and then he lost interest. Then he went to the University of Illinois Circle campus in Chicago for about a year or something. And that was that. And then we moved to San Diego and we had to establish residency. And then he went to San Diego State for a year, 6 months. I don't remember.
2 semesters.
2 semesters. Now we moved back to Illinois. I mean, nothing was ever finished. There was like no direction. And I just think that had a lot to do with it. He was just floundering, That's my opinion. Maybe it isn't his. But we really didn't talk enough about it. We just drank more.
Yeah.
To forget things, I don't know, that's how I think it affected, that wasn't the only reason, but I mean, I think Jeff's death, especially with him, just hit him so hard. And I think the first thing he said when he saw him laying in the casket was, "It really is you, buddy." Yeah, he told me that. It's all very powerful and emotional. It's sad.
Yeah. Do you think, like, after he passed away, it was harder to, like, stay in one spot or, like, feel satisfied with what you were doing?
At the time it didn't seem like that was the case, but, in retrospect, it could very well be at least some of it. It's like the chiropractic school, I was just, a little more than halfway through the first year when that happened. And some of it was, losing interest because of other things that I learned about the business of chiropractic, but that distracted me certainly, and made it all a little bit more difficult to focus, I guess. That was because, like I said, when you have a dream and that you think it seems so real, then you wake up feeling good, and then all of a sudden, disappointment, starts all over again.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? Like, after high school graduation in 1966, Jeff and Terry and 2 guys from San Diego who were back in Illinois and another guy all took a road trip in a little Volkswagen from Belvedere, Illinois to San Diego in a little Volkswagen Bug. And they were out there for 10 days, 12 days, something like that. And I often think, I'm so glad they did that, and Jeff had that experience, because it wasn't 2 years later, and not even, and he was gone, they had a riot. They had so much fun, you know. So I just put a little side note there, you know. On a positive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I you know, he was my best friend, but I didn't really even know him for 5 years. It was the first the first day of football practice in August of 1963, and it was this new kid is like holding the court. Everybody, he's joking and everybody's laughing at his jokes, and he was kind of stealing my job. That was, but after 2 weeks of football practice, we were best buds.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you guys like shared so many memories, even though it was only like.
Yeah. And we played football and basketball together in high school.
Jeff he liked to laugh. He was a jokester.
Yeah.
He was just a fun guy.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Smith had 6 kids. And I shouldn't say this, but I think Jeff was her favorite.
Yeah.
Well, that's obvious. You know, the lady had lung cancer. That's what eventually killed her. 9 years after, 10 years after, whatever it was, and she was laying in the hospital bed, and Jill and I were visiting, and.
Perfect. Okay, continue with your thought about TV, newspapers, and Vietnam.
Well, like I said, it was much more limited than it is today. That's for sure. And there wasn't detail. I'm sure that there was still some weekly news programs, you know, Meet the Press, Face the Nation. They've been around forever. They probably did more discussion of that, but you know, 19-year-old kids don't watch too much of that stuff back then. And but it was just the usual stuff that you heard on the 6 o'clock news when Walter Cronkite was, you know, tell you what went on in Vietnam today, and on numbers of people, you know, the sheer numbers of people, and little specifics, and it was like a week or 10 days later that the infamous My Lai massacre occurred, and that went on for a long time. I mean, the talk about that one specific event went on for a very long time, you know, including the court martial and, you know, the guy who supposedly was responsible, but, you know, a lot of people were probably responsible, and ultimately to kill somewhere between 350 and 500 people, Vietnamese.
Speaking of Walter Cronkite, he was one of the last, not one of the last, but one of the journalists on broadcasts that were calling publicly to an end of the Vietnam War. Do you guys remember seeing that?
You know, I don't remember specifically seeing that, but it was pretty clear that you know, by that time, or you know, within a year or so later, that it was started to really become a greater topic with more people. You know, it's, like I said, soon as you lose a friend or a son or a husband or, you know, father, it changes your perspective on something that you might have believed in the first place. That it becomes a whole different ball game, so to speak. kind of thing happens. And it still happens today. I mean, there's see, it seems to me like the ability to negotiate should be a whole lot more prevalent than it is. We don't really try too hard to get along with people that disagree with us.
Can I say something? This wasn't TV news, but some of the shows on TV, one of them was All in the Family, and with Archie Bunker, and I think everybody's heard of Archie Bunker. We're starting to, there were a couple different, shows on All in the Family that dealt with the Vietnam War, and it and that was a real kind of eye-opener to have the son-in-law and the father-in-law butt heads about the war. One was for it, one was very much against it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was becoming more and more accepted to be on TV, on shows, on actual TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
And they were pretty serious. Usually that show was pretty funny and lighthearted and stuff. But, those topics were starting to creep into the TV world too. And didn't the Smothers Brothers kind of get in trouble for?
Yeah, they did.
They had a show. And go ahead.
That was even before All in the Family. The Smothers Brothers were pretty outspoken about it, and kind of like a little bit. Some of the skits and sketches that they did were a little bit like what you see on Saturday Night Live that came along a few 5 or 6 years after the Smothers Brothers first got rolling.
But they got in trouble, with the network for pretty much saying what they thought. So, it was not a popular war, not at all. And my own father, who was in World War II, changed his mind 100%. Yeah, we need to fight communism, blah, 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 in the beginning. But you hear enough about it, you read enough about it, and you just see these hundreds of lives lost daily. It changes your whole perspective. And what did we accomplish over there?
Yeah.
Did we accomplish anything?
The only accomplishment was to create more enemies, I think. It seems like Vietnam's not doing all that badly, with however things are running, not as bad as it was before when, before the war and the French ran the show over there. Originally it was called French Indochina. That's what it was when we were in grade school. It was French Indochina. Names change. Like Peterman says, Myanmar, but it'll always be Burma to me.
Okay.
Earlier, in another video that also got erased, you were talking about young Sheldon.
About what?
Young Sheldon.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that again?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's, like I said, it's a perspective, Sheldon has a little buddy in school who's Vietnamese, and he has him over for dinner, and the dad tells the young Vietnamese kid that I was in your country, I was in the army, served in the Vietnam War, and the kid kind of interrupted him and says, "We called it the American War." And it's the the Confederate States had a different name for the Civil War than the northern states. I don't disagree. I don't agree with that interpretation either. It wasn't.
But interesting what what the Vietnamese, their perspective of that whole. We invaded them. Yeah.
I mean, it's
Vietnam
like
War.
it's like what's going on in Palestine, the Gaza. Yeah, they kill a couple of bad guys, Hamas bad guys, but they kill 100 innocent live people. It's like the bombs in Japan. Killed the two bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Killed almost 250,000 people, almost as many people as the Americans lost soldiers in World War II. I mean, and most of those were innocent people. They weren't military people. I think that perspective is still. People are aware of that the United States is the only country that ever did drop a nuclear bomb on somebody else. They think about that. This.
Do you remember what other countries kind of thought about the United States being in Vietnam? Did you guys hear about that very much?
Well, there was plenty of other countries that were serving with it, because there was a thing called the Southeast Treaty Organization, and that included a whole lot of countries around there. So the French, there were some French soldiers, there was Australian soldiers, there were British soldiers, of course, Italian soldiers. I'm not sure all the countries that sent, but the Russians probably had a few on the other side of the thing. Of course, the Chinese did as well. Yeah, it was not a good thing, I think. And what did they do in the end? They wound up having a big long negotiation that maybe they could have done some of that beforehand and prevented at least some of that. Who knows? No, nobody can win a war anymore. It's just a war of attrition. Who loses the most people? Nobody really wins.
Do the protests that are happening for the war happening in Gaza and in Israel and everything over there, does that remind you guys of the protests that happened for Vietnam?
Yeah, eventually it sure did, but by the time 1969 and 70, well, I mean there was a lot, there was a lot of people in Washington for that famous speech that Martin Luther King gave, but I mean after that, then there was more and more of those protests throughout the summers and the next few years. Became more prevalent than what it was prior to that, and like today, and it's the sad part is that that's not a winning solution either, because ultimately somebody always goes off and has to start burning things and looting things and tearing things down, and of course there's always a few heads that get knocked that shouldn't be, but people get worked up over some subjects, and rightfully so, I think.
Peaceful protest, yeah. If it can be kept that way. Yeah. You know, when I was young and Vietnam was going on, and Terry talks so much about perspective, and I didn't lose a best friend. I knew Jeff, and I knew how devastated he was, but I didn't pay a whole lot of attention. You know, if it doesn't affect you, and at the age you are, you have other things on your mind, you know. We pay a lot more attention now that we're older, and the war in Ukraine, you know, Russia invaded Ukraine, let's be perfectly clear, and that's a mess. And then, you know, the Palestinians did attack Israel, but that's just a continuing, you know, that every time I see pictures on the TV, it's just, you know, there's nothing left of the Gaza Strip, and it's, women and little kids are dying, and, you know, it's so depressing. You know, you just sometimes, where and when is it all going to end, you know? So, I don't know. I don't have anything more to say. War is a losing battle, you know. My dad and mom were married a year before the war ended.
Yeah.
I never, you know, I think about that a lot now that I'm 76 years old. They didn't know if they were going to see each other again. And a lot of couples didn't, you know. So they were so, you know, so happy that when it ended and they were reunited, and oh my gosh, I can only imagine. Yeah, so.
Do you guys have anything else to add about anything at all?
About anything? Any subject?
Any subject in the entire world.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't really know. You know, there's thoughts come into your head, and you can go off on. I can go off on a tangent.
Oh, can he?
Sometime, you know, but
He remembers so much more way back then about the Vietnam War, so much more than I do, and he has researched things too, you know. He'll disappear, you know, and he's in the bedroom looking up something, and I never get on that computer. I Google things. Yay, I Google stuff now, yay.
the folks who had their you-know-what together put this memorial up on the north side of Fort Wayne. Kylie and I stopped there and looked at it. It wasn't all done yet, but there was a little replica Vietnam wall there, but the print was a little smaller on there. But Kylie found my buddy's name on there right away. But it's quite an impressive collection of all kinds of stuff now. I mean, there's memorials to Korea and not just Vietnam. You know, it's pretty neat setup they got there.
Yeah, I'd like to see that sometime. Yeah, in 8th grade, Brian took a trip to Washington, D.C., and they saw the wall, you know, and I think the names, it's not alphabetical, isn't it? The year in which
by date.
By date that they were killed, and.
But I mean, there's no dates up there. They're just, the names are listed chronologically, but.
Yeah.
That takes a while to find.
Yeah, he found it, and there was more than one Jeff Smith, but it was Jeff E. Smith, and he did a rub of it, you know, so I brought it back for Terry. I think he still has it somewhere, yeah, so. Something we'll never forget, that's for sure. And on the date that he died, you know, he said, you know, was March 7th.
Yeah.
It's March 7th, that's the day Jeff died. And also Memorial Day, he gets pretty choked out still, and probably always will, you know.
Yeah. Is it like?
You want to take that book home with you?
Yeah, I'll take a book home with me.
That his big brother wrote. His
Actually,
big brother was a journalist that worked in, I don't know, one of the Atlanta newspapers for a number of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's a great idea.